12th of July, 1989, in the Göhrde Forest east of Lüneburg, Germany, the bodies of a married couple who had gone on a picnic were discovered. Their killer must have been an extraordinarily cold-blooded person, because at the very moment the police were examining the crime scene, he set out in search of his next victims, and he found them. Soon after, the wife of a wealthy businessman vanished without a trace in Lüneburg, but her disappearance attracted little attention due to the murders in Göhrde. A huge mistake, as would become clear almost 3 decades later, because this very case held the key to identifying Germany's most extraordinary serial killer. He carried out murders that kept the entire north of the country on edge, and the fact that some of his crimes have now been solved and families have finally received answers is thanks to one investigator who had lost his sister. On the morning of August 15, 1989, the telephone rang in the office of Wolfgang Silaff.
"Mom is missing,"
he heard through tears. The voice of Yasmin, the 20-year-old daughter of his younger sister, 41-year-old Birgit Meier. Wolfgang immediately understood that his sister could not have simply disappeared and abandoned her daughter. Even though Yasmin was no longer a child, she and her mother shared a very close and trusting relationship. In 1989, Wolfgang headed the Hamburg State Criminal Police Office. However, even a man of such influence was unable to secure a thorough investigation into his sister's disappearance by the police in the city of Lüneburg, where Birgit lived. First, the Lüneburg police were consumed by the investigation of 2 murders and had devoted all their resources to those cases. Second, beyond being overworked, they had another reason to treat this case somewhat carelessly. From the very beginning, they had a suspect, Birgit's husband, Harald Meier. He was a successful businessman working in the printing industry. He and Birgit had separated several months before her disappearance, and Harald had begun seeing another woman. Birgit, who was not working at the time of the separation, struggled more with the impending divorce and sometimes sought comfort in alcohol. However, on the evening of 14th August 1989, Birgit greeted her husband with a smile. Harald had come to discuss the terms of their separation, and it seemed that Birgit had finally managed to get a grip on her emotions. Birgit and Harald discussed the divorce terms quite amicably. It was to receive 500,000 German marks and agreed to move out of the family home near Lüneburg. The following day, the two planned to go to a notary together. However, that morning, Yasmin discovered that her mother was missing. Her Opel convertible was still in the garage, but the woman herself was nowhere to be found in the house. As would later become known, her personal documents had also disappeared. A single shoe print near Birgit's home. There were no signs whatsoever that a crime had occurred, no blood and no evidence of a struggle. According to Birgit's husband, the previous evening had passed normally and without any arguments. After he left, Birgit spoke on the phone with her mother and her daughter, and she also said that she and her husband had not argued and that the meeting had gone very well. Nevertheless, despite Harald's statements, the police suspected that the husband had found another way to part with his wife and avoid paying her the 500,000 marks. Today, Harald Meier still lives in the very house from which his wife vanished without a trace. He recalls that Birgit had always remained his friend, someone he could rely on completely. However, many people considered Harald guilty, first of her disappearance and later of her murder. He heard the constant whispering behind his back. His friends wondered whether he had driven Birgit away in his Porsche and dumped her body into the sea from a motorboat. Even in the gaze of his own daughter, a silent question would sometimes flicker. Could he have known something about where her mother was? Could the police be right in their suspicions? Only Wolfgang Silaff believed that Harald had nothing to do with his sister's disappearance, because he and Birgit had never argued over money. When Birgit met Harald that evening 32 years ago, she was nicely dressed, and he immediately noticed that she had had a little to drink to lift her spirits. He teased her, suggesting that she probably wouldn't be bored for long, and she flirtatiously replied, "Who knows?" Now he believes that at that very moment her killer was nearby, already waiting for the right opportunity to strike. However, it was only 6 weeks after Birgit's disappearance that Harald began to have his first suspicions about what might have happened that day. A colleague of his wife told him that on the day of Birgit's disappearance, she had cheerfully mentioned the neighbor's gardener in conversation. Supposedly, he had rung Birgit's doorbell and, after explaining who he was, asked for directions to the house he was looking for, despite already knowing the address. Harold didn't know what to make of it. He recalled a party at a neighboring house where the gardener had also been present. A quiet, taciturn man, a blonde with very handsome features, but a disturbing gaze. Harold remembered how deeply the cold, appraising look of his icy eyes had frightened him, and now it emerged that Birgit had met him several months before her disappearance, right after that very party at the neighbor's. She had drunk too much that evening, and the gardener had walked her home. Harold informed the police about his wife's new acquaintance. Investigators determined that the gardener, who also worked at a cemetery, was named Kurt Werner Wichmann. Handsome, but extremely dangerous. Even as a child, he had threatened a young mother and her child with a knife. In his early youth, he kidnapped a hitchhiking girl, assaulted her, and nearly killed her. After that attack, he spent 5.5 years in prison. The investigators decided to speak with Wichmann in person and invited him to the police station. He showed up wearing gloves, explaining that he had an allergy. The man claimed that he had an alibi for the time of the woman's disappearance. After work, he said he had spent the entire evening at home and might only have gone out for a walk with his German Shepherd after 10 p.m., which would not have taken more than 15 minutes. His wife confirmed his account. Wichmann prudently chose not to mention that on the day Birgit disappeared, he had been on sick leave and did not need to go to work at all. It would have been no trouble for the police to establish this, but surprisingly, not a single investigator considered Wichmann a suspect worth serious attention. Wolfgang notes that at the very least a preliminary investigation should have been opened. However, that never happened. The missing woman's brother constantly heard from his colleagues that they were doing everything possible but, unfortunately, could not find her. Whenever he tried to obtain more information about the case, they fell silent. Days, months, and years passed this way before a new public prosecutor in Lüneburg took over the case. Only in 1993, 3.5 years after Birgit's disappearance, was a criminal case opened against Kurt Werner Wichmann on suspicion of murdering Birgit Meier. On a cold February morning in 1993, police officers knocked on the door of a brick house on the outskirts of Lüneburg, the home of Kurt Werner Wichmann. The door was opened by his wife. Her husband was not at home. The officers presented a search warrant and began their work. A sniffer dog immediately led them to a recently demolished drywall partition in the basement. On the ground floor, they also noticed a soundproof door. Kurt's wife explained that she did not have a key, only her husband and his brother did. The officers forced the door open, and behind it they found a veritable arsenal: 2 small-caliber rifles, a revolver, suppressors, ammunition, stun guns, knives, sleeping pills, chains, cords, and handcuffs bearing traces of blood. All of these items were seized by the police. During a search of the grounds surrounding the house, a metal detector went off. Using an excavator, the police unearthed something extraordinary in Wichmann's garden: a whole car, a brand new bright red Ford sports coupe. On the back seat, forensic experts found blood. The sniffer dog also clearly detected the scent of a body inside the vehicle, but no body was found. A little later, police discovered a VW Golf parked near Lüneburg, registered to Wichmann. Inside were road maps, a sleeping bag, a thermos, and binoculars. Equipment more fitting for a hunter, or for someone who spends a great deal of time stalking the people he intends to kill. For several weeks, Kurt managed to evade the investigators. However, on the 15th of April 1993, an accident occurred on a rural road near Heilbronn. The police inspected a car carrying 2 men. Weapons were found in the vehicle, so the driver was taken to the police station. There, it emerged that the driver was Kurt, and that his younger brother had been sitting next to him in the car. At the station, the police did not believe that Kurt posed a danger to himself, and therefore did not confiscate his belt. The man died in his prison cell on 25th April 1993 at the age of 43. The police closed the case fairly quickly because under German criminal procedure law, the dead are not supposed to become the subject of an investigation. However, this was far from the end of the story. Rather, it was the beginning of an inquiry that would lead to the exposure of some of the most horrifying crimes in the country's criminal history. In 2002, Wolfgang retired and was finally able to devote more time and attention to his sister's case. He was granted access to the case files and was shocked. To his horror, he discovered that all the evidence had been destroyed, including the red Ford that had been dug out of the ground. Even the basement of Kurt's house, where the sniffer dog had sensed the presence of human remains, had never been thoroughly examined. In Wolfgang's view, the evidence should have been preserved. First, because there is no statute of limitations for murder. Second, the principle of not investigating the dead does not apply in this case because there was still another suspect, Birgit's husband, Harold. To either clear or convict Harold, all the evidence should have been examined, Kurt's neighbors questioned, and in short, standard police work carried out. But by then, the evidence could no longer be reviewed. Wolfgang refused to give up. He assembled a group of volunteers from among former colleagues. Again and again, they discussed motives, possible sequences of events, and the perpetrator's behavior. Eventually, they came up with the idea that Birgit's disappearance might be connected to other unsolved crimes. In search of confirmation, Wolfgang went to Wichmann's house. The secret room had hardly changed since it was discovered in 1993. Inside, he found video recordings of 2 television programs, one about Birgit Meier's disappearance and the other about the Göhrde murders. Wolfgang immediately informed the Lüneburg police, and nothing happened. In 2015, the leadership of the Lüneburg State Criminal Police Office changed. Wolfgang managed to persuade the new head to set up a commission to review his sister's case. The commission was led by an experienced and, in the best sense of the word, meticulous investigator who, over the previous several years, had solved all of his cases, Richard Kaufmann. Kaufmann discovered that on the handcuffs found in Wichmann's secret room, investigators had detected a tiny droplet of blood. This sample had not been destroyed because it was stored in a laboratory in Hanover. DNA comparison showed that the blood belonged to Birgit Meier. There was now no doubt that Wichmann had restrained Birgit with handcuffs and then, most likely, killed her. The investigator concluded that Wichmann had intended to kidnap her and demand a ransom from Harold, but something went wrong. It was also clear that at least 2 people had been involved in the abduction because that night a neighbor had heard the sound of a car engine running. Where could Birgit's body have been? The investigator examined several graves dug at the cemetery where Wichmann had worked, but Birgit Meier was not among them. At that point, Wolfgang decided to learn everything he could about the man's past. First of all, it was important not to imagine him as a spoiled boy from a perfect family. His father sometimes threatened his mother with an axe and was cruel to his sons. The young Kurt Werner Wichmann was placed in the Witchenstift Social Institution, and after the New Year holidays in 1964, he did not want to return. But to escape, he needed money. So the 14-year-old broke into the apartment of his parents' tenants, a young family carrying a dagger and a flashlight. The husband was at work, and only the mother and infant were at home. The woman woke up due to the flashlight beam and screamed. The boy slightly strangled her to stop her from yelling. Then he turned to the child, and the woman feared he would harm her son. But fortunately, he changed his mind. Unfortunately, the young woman whom 22-year-old Kurt picked up hitchhiking in 1970 was not so lucky. He offered her a ride in his car, drove her into the forest, and attacked her. After taking what he wanted, he slightly strangled the girl and put her in the trunk, apparently planning to bury her. But something incredible happened. When he reopened the trunk, the girl had regained enough composure to convince him to let her go, claiming that he had no reason to fear her. 2 days later, when he read a newspaper article about the attack, he realized the events had been reported differently than he thought they happened. What did he do? He went to the police, claiming he wanted to correct some facts. After that, he served 5.5 years in prison. Realizing the kind of man Kurt was, Wolfgang understood that he was obsessed with control. He was a narcissist for whom it was crucial how others perceived him. His desire to control his outward image was so strong that he would even surrender after committing a crime. This meant he would also need to control the location of his victim's body. Therefore, Wolfgang hypothesized that his sister Birgit Meier's body was hidden in the house or on the property of Wichmann's home. It is tragic that when he had asked the Lüneburg police years earlier to conduct a thorough search there, they had ignored him. As the head of the investigative team told him, his criminal experience suggested Birgit wasn't there. Yet while he said this, he was standing directly above her body, separated only by a concrete slab, when, many years later, Wolfgang finally broke open the concrete floor in Kurt's garage. He discovered what remained of his sister's body. The autopsy revealed that Birgit Meier had been killed by a gunshot to the head. Birgit's case had been solved, but Wolfgang refused to stop there, remembering other families still waiting for justice for their loved ones. Thanks solely to Wolfgang's persistence, at the end of 2017, the crime that had terrorized northern Germany in the 1990s, the Göhrde murders, was finally solved. Göhrde is a vast forested area east of Lüneburg. In July 1989, northern Germany was experiencing sunny and hot weather, so many people sought relief from the summer heat in the shady forest. On July 12, 1989, just 2 days before Birgit's disappearance, 3 people collecting blueberries in Göhrde suddenly noticed a nauseatingly sweet smell. Following it, they found a human hand beneath a pine tree among the branches. It turned out that on 21 May 1989, a married couple from Hamburg, 51-year-old Peter and 45-year-old Ursula Reinhold, had gone on a picnic in the forest to enjoy the outdoors. They had been brutally murdered and their bodies dragged away from the attack site. The husband and wife were almost naked when discovered, though it was unclear whether the killer had undressed them or they had done so themselves before the attack. The murderer took their picnic basket, binoculars, and car keys, later using the vehicle to leave the area. The car was eventually found in another city. Although their disappearance had been reported, it took 7 weeks to locate them. The heat had left the bodies badly decomposed, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. But robbery was ruled out, as valuables were still on the victims. Since mobile phones did not exist, the berry pickers hurried to inform the forest ranger, who reported the find to the police. It wasn't just the bodies themselves that terrified the Germans, earning Göhrde the nickname the Dead Forest. What made the case uniquely chilling in modern German criminal history was that while the police were still examining Peter and Ursula's bodies, the killer took the lives of another couple just 800 meters away from the investigators. On July 12, 1989, 46-year-old Ingrid Wormbier and 43-year-old Bernd Michael Köpping from Hanover visited Göhrde. Though married, they were not spouses of each other, which is why they had chosen this forest. After parking their car, they walked about 2 kilometers into the woods. They were brutally murdered, and the killer took their Polaroid camera and car keys before leaving in their vehicle. Later investigations determined that he had driven the car for about a week before abandoning it. The bodies were discovered by chance 2 weeks later, when police were combing the area because of the previous murder. The 2 crime scenes were only 800 meters apart, but tests later showed that the officers investigating the first murder could not have heard the gunshots due to the sites being located in forest depressions. In light of this new evidence, the chance encounter of the berry pickers gained importance. On their way to the forest ranger to report the gruesome discovery, they encountered a man. Although 2 weeks later their description would be vague, they recalled a tall, strong 40-year-old man with medium-length brown hair, no glasses, no beard. He carried a bag that was clearly not empty. Based on the witness's account, a composite sketch was made, even if this man was not involved in the crime. What the murders had in common was that they all occurred within the same area of the vast forest. In addition, the victims were all middle-aged. In 2 cases, the perpetrator stole the victim's belongings, though robbery was clearly not the main motive. He left the crime scenes using the victims' cars and later abandoned the vehicles in small towns with train stations. Both towns lie along the Hanover to Hamburg route, and these parallels led investigators to suspect that the same person was responsible for both crimes. In 1989, Wichmann was 40 years old and lived about 30 kilometers from Göhrde. On the day the secret lovers were killed, he was on sick leave. The married couple was killed on a Sunday, again a day when Kurt did not need to go to work. However, the investigators initially handling the Göhrde murders found no evidence linking Wichmann to the crime scenes. Moreover, he did not resemble the composite sketch that had been drawn. As a result, the police focused on other suspects. In particular, they suspected that the deceived husband of the second couple had hired a professional to deal with his unfaithful wife and her lover, but the hitman had apparently killed the wrong couple first, before fulfilling the contract. Once again, Wolfgang could not understand the investigators' decisions. He and his group of colleagues immediately suspected that Kurt matched the profile of the Göhrde killer. The brutality of the crimes, the intimate element revealed by the women's disheveled clothing, all of it fit Wichmann's profile. Moreover, many years earlier, Wolfgang had found in Kurt's secret room a video recording of the TV program which covered the Göhrde murders. As a narcissist, Kurt also collected video recordings and newspaper clippings about Birgit Meier. Additional evidence showed that he had researched relatives of Bernd Michael Köpping, one of the Göhrde victims. However, the final breakthrough, as so often happens today, came from DNA analysis. The Göhrde killer had a habit of driving the cars of his victims for several days. In one of the vehicles, 3 hairs and possibly other biological material were found, but it took nearly 30 years before the DNA from the car was compared to Kurt's DNA. At the end of 2017, the results came back, a match. The perpetrator of the 2 Göhrde murders was Kurt Werner Wichmann. Following this discovery, a special investigative team was established in Lüneburg to analyze Wichmann's murders and create a criminal profile. It was suspected that he could be linked to as many as 24 additional murders. The police also planned to examine similar crimes in other European countries, believing that Kurt might have been involved. However, by early 2020, the police announced that they had reviewed only half of the collected evidence, and apart from the 5 murders definitively linked to Wichmann, could not establish a connection to any other cases. The question of motive, and at least one other person who knew all of Wichmann's affairs, remains unresolved. If he was leaving Göhrde in the victims' cars, how was he getting to Göhrde in the first place? And what was the sound of a running car engine that Birgit's neighbor heard? There is someone who knew Kurt better than anyone else. But will he speak to the police? This is Kurt's younger brother, 10 years his junior. He had been extremely dependent on Kurt, seeking his advice on everything, even the smallest matters. In his farewell letters, Kurt gave him instructions that could be interpreted as coded messages. For example, telling him to clean the gutter above the basement entrance once, but very carefully. A rather strange final request, isn't it? Undoubtedly, he knows more about his brother and his life than he will ever reveal. A small, quiet, taciturn man, the complete opposite of his brother. Or is he?